So this is a picture of Benjamin and a little bit about him. Ben Perrin researches and teaches in the areas of criminal law and international law. He joined UBC in 2007 and served as a law clerk at the Supreme Court of Canada and special advisor in the Office of the Prime Minister. Ben is the author of policy papers, journal articles, and several books, including Overdose, Heartbreak and Hope in Canada's Opioid Crisis, and Victim Law, the Law of Victims of Crime in Canada. So Benjamin, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen so we can see you. And I think I do that by pinning you. There we go. So welcome, Benjamin, and thank you for joining us. If you want to begin, maybe just a little bit about what brought you to writing Overdose.
Yeah, so I have been working in the field of criminal law for, I guess, about 12, 13, 14 years now. And it's been at a couple of levels. I went to law school in Toronto. While I was a law student, I represented clients on legal aid. These were people who obviously couldn't afford a legal counsel. And I had a client that I talk about in the book who was arrested for possession of it was a small bag, a little piece of plastic of cocaine that slipped out of his pocket when the police were carding him. Some of you have probably heard of that practice. He wasn't suspected of doing anything wrong. He was homeless. So they started asking him questions. And that doesn't happen to people like me. And when I say people like me, I'm talking about professional white men, right? It doesn't happen. I've never been carded in my life. I never will be. And yet this man was. And so that was my first exposure in terms of like the criminal justice system interacting. And the Crown didn't really want to prosecute them. They've got a pile of cases this tall. And this was a homeless person who had caused no harm. He wasn't bothering anyone, but the police went ahead with laying the charge, and the Crown just wanted it to go away. And so the way they do that is they say, well, he can just pay $100 fine. And I said, I don't think you're getting the picture here. Like this guy lives on the street. Like he doesn't have $100 sitting around. And that was what they wanted. It's a machine, and they wanted him to have a criminal record, right, as well, because you pay a fine, you get a record. And then, of course, if it happens again, they will go, oh, the $100 fine didn't work. Now we're going to look at maybe like a week in jail or something for you, right? So that was my first experience as a law student with our drug laws. I have had experience myself with substances too, though. I think it's really important to be really kind of open and honest. And I realized, like much later in life, that in law school, I too, while I was defending this client who'd been charged with possession of a really small little amount of drugs, I was part of a very much an alcohol fueled culture, university alone, law school in particular, and then working for a big Bay Street law firm that very summer, and just the thousands of dollars people were spending on alcohol. And so looking back, I sort of see the irony of some of this stuff. But the opioid crisis for me didn't become real until I started hearing story after story on the news driving to my job at the law school. This is a fake background, right? I'm in my basement like everyone else, but it looks fancy, eh? Real official. Yeah, this is what our law library looks like, and I'm not actually there, but I'll do a big reveal later if you stick around, and you'll see what my basement looks like. But yeah, driving to and from that office, I kept hearing story after story of people dying from overdose death. And it didn't take a genius to figure out these weren't just one-off things. And sure enough, the BC government in 2016 declared a provincial state of emergency, which is still in effect today because of the loss of life from drug-related overdose deaths. And so I'd been sort of thinking about this issue, but one day I pulled over. I literally pulled over on a commute after hearing yet another one of these stories of another person who died. And I prayed. I'd been raised going to church, but I really had no relationship at all with God. I knew all the Bible stories and all that stuff, but I did pray, and I've thought of myself as a good kind of Christian, even though my life bore no resemblance to anything like that at all, really. And I just prayed. I asked God to give me a heart of compassion for people who are dying. I said, there's all these people who are dying. I don't seem to care, and it bothered me that I didn't. I was worried that I had become so desensitized to this what they were saying now was killing more people in BC than car accidents, homicides, and suicides combined. So if you combine all those three, it was the leading cause of what's called unnatural death. So if you take out, cancer and heart disease and that stuff, right? And the other reason it bothered me is that I had been part of for 1 year, I'd taken a leave of absence. I mentioned working for the Prime Minister, for Prime Minister Harper, who was very much opposed to any programs which would provide for harm reduction. So things like supervised consumption sites, things like providing a safe supply of drugs. I'd never really given much thought to that, and I wasn't part of that apparatus. It was already there, but I never questioned it. It was, drugs are bad, they hurt people, so they should be illegal. That was like the sum total of and I put logic in air quotes if people aren't looking at the screen, the logic of that, right? And I look back now and see it was just a combination of ignorance and ideology that was driven that. It wasn't based on any research or policy thinking or anything, and fueled by a lot of stigma against people who use drugs, and judgment and blame of people who use drugs, and that lack of understanding. And it's not an innocent lack of understanding. I never bothered to, look into it any further. And from that prayer to, boy, just a couple months later, I then found myself sitting down and talking to people who had overdosed, who had lost family members to drug overdose, who were police officers who had been there and trying to say, we're not charging people, but we also know this isn't going to help. And basically this research project became my main focus. No one else was looking into it in terms of any kind of criminal law professor or anything like that in Canada. And so I thought, well, look, someone's got to look into this. And as I did, I was committed to having an open mind. And you mentioned that earlier, Jeffrey, and in your introduction. I think it's really important for us to come first with an open mind to any topic, but particularly this topic. We were all raised in different times and places around views around drugs. Some people here probably grew up in the 60s and 70s. Some of us grew up in the 80s like me with the Say No to Drugs campaigns and all the popular culture stuff. So we've all got a lot of cultural baggage, and some of us have lived experience as well with substances. And perhaps people here have been personally touched by this tragedy as well. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that. But I never knew anyone who had overdosed and died. A lot of people thought, oh, if you had this big kind of conversion or road to Damascus moment, which for me it really was, like literally, we can talk later about it, but it was also a big faith journey for me, realizing that I was basically, those of you who've read through some of the New Testament, you'll know Jesus didn't spend his time condemning the people who were sinners. The people who he condemned were the Pharisees. They were the ones he called out, right? He actually sat and had dinner with the tax collectors and sinners, again in air quotes, and the Pharisees were like, what are you doing? And he was the one he called hypocrites, and John the Baptist called a brood of vipers. So I began to realize that, look, if Jesus was here today and I'm claiming I'm kind of following him, as I'm doing this research, I'm like, he's going to be in two places. He's going to be helping the marginalized and downcast people in society, who I began to learn were many people using substances because of deep pain and unresolved trauma in their lives, and much of it intergenerational as well, particularly with Indigenous peoples. And he would have been calling out people like me, were kind of like self-righteous, stop using drugs. This is a moral failing that's really the root of our drug laws. So that's kind of how it began for me. And it really went from there. And the more people I met, the more research. It wasn't just reading research. I think that's important to emphasize, and in particular, I understand you're having a debate in your community about supervised injection sites. I can tell you and we'll get to that, but there's over 100 peer-reviewed studies that support them, okay? I can tell you right now that if I were able to sort of say, talk to my health colleagues at UBC and say, hey, what we need to convince some people of this is we need 100 more, okay? If 100 is not enough, 200 is not going to be enough, all right? So this is not about evidence. It's about people whose minds are closed and hearts are hard. And I say that as someone who had both of those problems. And so we need to have soft hearts and open minds. And for me, I needed to see the heart needed to change first before I could open my mind. So that's where I would kind of begin, I guess.
That's really great. Thank you. Something that I discovered as reading your book was a lot of the challenges that exist, not only to open those hearts and minds, but within the system itself. Like something that I was quite shocked by was our mail system and how it allows fentanyl to come into the country. That's not in any other book that I've read about this crisis, actually. But I was wondering, where did you find those challenges for yourself? What challenged you within your research that made you have to continually reform your perspective?
Well, I knew that the status quo wasn't working. I mean, it was clear enough to me that if you've got a system and thousands upon thousands of people, at that point it was around 14,000 people had died nationally over a very short period of time. And I want to talk about what's happening right now during COVID in Ontario too. I've got some statistics some of you may have seen that came out this month from Public Health Ontario. But basically, I knew it wasn't working, so I had to figure out for myself really, what was going wrong, and all of the kind of usual things that would be done by governments to try to suppress things just haven't worked, and they've actually made it worse. So yeah, I thought, why not stop the supply? Like, why is that not working, right? This is like classic war on drug stuff, which we'll get to maybe in a second. But the default position that Canada still has is it's all about supply and demand. Okay, so we've got to kind of squeeze the supply and then address the demand, and that's how you'll get people to supposedly stop using drugs, right? We know that doesn't work. And in fact, not only does it work, it's actually made things a lot worse. And in my research found it's actually been one of the causes of the opioid crisis. So yeah, it turns out there's, how is fentanyl getting into Canada? I talked to the top sort of border intelligence officers here in Vancouver, and they said that they are finding it in packages as small as greeting cards. So think about a birthday card. You remember you used to get mail, okay? Literally it's in something like a Ziploc bag, squished real tiny, and just a little bit. That's enough for fentanyl, which is a synthetic opioid. It can be made in a lab with college level chemistry skills and equipment. And so most of it into Western Canada is coming through from China. And this isn't like secondhand information. I went directly to the people who were checking the mail and pulling the packages. And they said, I asked them, so how much are we talking about here? Like, how many pieces of mail are you having to search? And so, well, we can't obviously search them all. I said, well, yeah, for sure. But like some sort of sample, like how many, letters, for example, or packages come in from China every month? And they said 1.2 million. And I was like, well, like, no, maybe you misheard. Like, I didn't say a year, no, they're like, no, in a month, 1.2 million letters and small packages a month from China. And do you know how many they seized? You've probably read my book more recently than I have, Jeffrey, but I think it's around like 50 or 60. It's like one a week, right? It's like they're getting like one a week. And it turns out that you can buy this stuff on what's called the dark web, which is just a part of the internet that's a little bit more anonymous. And you can use cryptocurrency to buy it. And it will be delivered to your front door by Canada Post. And if you want to make it a little harder for the police, what I found is you just get a post office box. And if you're worried about the police watching and waiting for you to come and check your mail to get your fentanyl, which even if they knew was there, they have to put on a surveillance team and a counter for surveillance team. And the cost of that to get one little package isn't worth it. They just won't do it. They don't do it. They can't. And in fact, they didn't even have the authority. They still don't, to take the fentanyl out and put some fake thing in and have it be delivered. So that turned out to be a big waste of time. Not a waste of time in the research, but in terms of the resources we're putting in. A lot of conservative premiers say we got to shut this down at the border. That's never worked for any drug, let alone a synthetic drug. And when Canada has tried to do that with things like methamphetamine, we've actually shut down more at the border. And what happened is Canada then began to produce it such that we're now an exporter to the world. So when you're dealing with synthetic drugs like this, there is no shutting the tap off. There is no shutting the tap off. So that was a big shift for me, is realizing that. And then when I looked at demand, what I learned about, why people use drugs, it really had a big impact on me. And this is, sitting down, talking to people, and also hearing from everyone from judges to Crown prosecutors being like, I've had more than one Crown prosecutor and multiple cabinet ministers in the Trudeau government, after they've left, say to me, like, this is wrong. Like, I can't continue my career as a drug prosecutor. These are like bright young people, top of their career, and they're leaving their careers because they're like, I can't be part of this system anymore because it's unethical and wrong. And we are punishing people who have a substance use disorder. Okay. The definition of an addiction is essentially that you want to stop it, you can't, right? And so the way that opioid use disorder manifests itself is that even when people want to stop using or want to cut down, and even if they're successful in going into like detox, where they completely stop using opioids for 28-day detox period, what the medical research shows is that they're actually more likely to overdose and die than someone who never went into that, because their tolerance rapidly goes down. And then when they inevitably relapse, unless they've got substantial treatment and support, and there is support and treatment that's available and works for some people, they are much more likely to overdose and die. And the people who we do lock up in jail, whether they're in there on drug charges or other charges, the vast majority of people incarcerated in Canada have a substance use disorder of one kind or another, and a sizable amount are intravenous drug users. And so when you pull the statistics around who's actually dying, in BC, they went and pulled every single overdose death case. And what they found is about 2/3 of those individuals had at some point been incarcerated. And the biggest risk is within 2 weeks of being released from prison. And so we're actually issuing like a death sentence to people when we send them to jail, and then release them without anything like, let alone getting to things like trauma counseling, methadone and Suboxone and other medications that can help them to stave off the withdrawal symptoms that are the principal reason for them to, use again. It's not about getting high anymore. It's about staving off the symptoms of withdrawal. My view as someone who has not used, hard drugs, was that people are getting high and this is kind of like this kind of party thing. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about people who've many of them, there's also genetic aspects, but many people have suffered severe childhood trauma. And, the most extreme cases I heard about from a judge in Vancouver, I said, like, who was coming before your court on drug charges? Like, I want to hear, like, tell me the kinds of stories you're hearing. And she said, well, it's people from all over Canada, because many people end up at the end of the line in the downtown east side. They end up here from all over. She says, she always asks people, where are they from? And it's like, you name it. It could be anywhere in the country, right? Because you can actually, for the most part, physically survive here because of our climate. Okay. People still have, this is not like there's no nice place to be homeless, but like when I grew up in Calgary and I lived in Toronto, we're talking about, you do have street homeless populations, but here it has become a real Canadian city in that way. And she said many people everyone has a story of some sort of pain or trauma in their life. And the most serious, she had more than one client. Both of them were Indigenous men, and they're probably our age now, middle-aged men. But as children, they were, as toddlers, she said, more than one person, they witnessed their mothers being murdered in front of them by their fathers. And they were left with the body for days. And so now turning to, opioids, which are literally pain medicines. Like fentanyl was created for palliative cancer patients in the 1950s. Okay. It's for pain medicine. That's what it's used for now. Many of you, if you've gone through any operation or surgery, you've probably been given fentanyl. I was for a medical procedure like a year ago. My son was when he was in for emergency surgery. And I asked, what's fentanyl? And it's fine if it's titrated and it's with someone's there who's knows what to do and the quantity. But when it's mixed in with street drugs, you don't know how much you're getting, or you're using alone, or a combination of those things. That's what has led to this toxic drug supply we have everywhere in Canada. And the last thing I'll say about that, Jeffrey, and this sort of like supply demand thing is, it turns out that this whole opioid crisis thing was like predicted like 30 or 40 years ago. There's something you might have heard of called the iron law of prohibition. This is something they observed during alcohol prohibition, right? As you crack down on supply and sort of seize things like beer, maybe this is something people can relate to because alcohol is something more people have had exposure to. Think about the alcohol content of beer. Unless you're drinking some IPAs or something, you're around like 5% or something here, okay? So that's really bulky, okay? So what happens is, that getting seized is really easy to find. So you go to moonshine, right? Higher and higher concentrations of alcohol. The same thing has happened with cannabis, cocaine, and heroin over the course of the war on drugs. They have globally seized hundreds of tons per year, okay? Not kilograms, tons, hundreds of tons of heroin and cocaine every year. And what has happened is that what has made it in has become more potent and less expensive. And so synthetic drugs and opiates were predicted in the 1980s to result from the global war on drugs. And sure enough, we are reaping that now.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, there's so much that you've just shared that has reignited my reminders within the book as well of things to talk about. So something else that I was really, I was sort of changed by was your approach to supporting harm reduction techniques like supervised consumption and the decriminalization of illicit substances as well. And I was wondering if you could share, your research is both also living and paper, right? You talk to so many people that are living this experience, but also peer-reviewed medical journals. And I was wondering about your discovery of those harm reduction techniques and sort of where you now sit with those.
Yeah. So I definitely was very suspicious of things like supervised consumption sites. I mean, like I said, I worked for the Harper government and sort of drank the Kool-Aid in terms of assuming that these would enable drug use. That's always the way that they're framed, or that, you know, we should instead be investing in treatment instead of these. That's something you hear from Premier Ford, from Premier Kenny in Alberta, from the federal Conservative Party still. And so I was, you know, skeptical, but like I said, I knew I had to keep an open mind. So I went and actually went to a supervised consumption site in Vancouver, and I was not at all surprised by what I saw. I saw people using drugs. That's what I expected to see. But what I began to realize is these are very controversial in some communities. I have to say they're entirely non-controversial now in the Vancouver area, in BC broadly. I think there's close to 50 of them or something like this. It's a huge, huge number. And yet there's still sort of this mystified, controversial thing. So let me just walk through what a supervised consumption site is. So when someone in any setting, at home, in a shelter, on the street, in a hotel, in an RV, in a tent, wherever they are, okay, anywhere you are, and they're using drugs or using opioids, particularly if they're street drugs, street opioids, they don't know what they're getting. They don't know the potency of the content. And so what an overdose is if they basically take too much, then their body is able to process, and it varies if you've used them before or not, or how much you've used. But if you take too much, you're going to go unconscious, and your breathing is going to slow. And if you've taken way too much, your breathing is going to actually stop. And within 3 or 4 minutes, you're going to suffer permanent brain damage. And if it goes beyond that, you're deceased. Okay, so that, just for people, so this sort of, what is an overdose? That's it. Literally, it is a silent death, and it happens very, very quickly. Okay, so that's the two things: is that the impact is obviously massive, and the speed at which it occurs is tremendously quick. And so what do you do if someone overdoses? Before we even talk about supervised injection sites, what do you do? The first thing is, don't use alone. That's the number one piece of advice. And we talk about COVID, we're going to hear that's going to be a problem, right? But here we go. So the first tip is, don't use alone. The second thing is naloxone. So naloxone is essentially described as an antidote. It temporarily reverses the effects of an overdose. And so depending on the potency or quantity of opioids that have been taken, you need more or less naloxone to literally revive the person. It's been called the Lazarus drug, bringing the person quite literally back to life, if you will. And that person may also need to be provided with oxygen, so either rescue breathing or with some sort of your respirator. And then they come to, and if there has been no permanent brain damage, they kind of go on and go about their life. I will pause and say that they're at greater risk of overdosing and dying if it's happened once, but just to flag. So that's the public health intervention. Provide naloxone, and if needed, provide oxygen. And there's different sort of tips around whether you call 911 or not now. And the advice I would say now is you still do, but I can tell you that that's not happening. So that all the 911 calls are not all the overdoses that are happening. Many people are not calling, and some of it's because of fear of criminalization, even though there's a law which would protect you from prosecution in at least some way there. So people are dying when they're not getting, when they're using alone and they overdose, and that's how they die. That's almost between 2/3 and 3/4 of people. Okay, people who are with someone, there is naloxone, and that person knows what to do, they are very, very likely to live. So what a supervised consumption site is it is literally just a place that you go to, and these don't have to be fancy. Some of them are in tents, as you know, canvas tents. They don't need to be a big medicalized model, okay? Literally, I walked in, and all there is there's some clean supplies, so that someone who only is reusing the same syringe again and again, and putting themselves at risk of communicable disease, or even sharing syringes or getting risk of infection. So instead of using that, we say, here's you're going to use. So here's a clean syringe, okay, and water to wash your hands, okay, and soap to wash your hands. And that person uses the drugs they have brought in. So they're not supplied with the drugs. They've brought their own drugs in, and they literally use them. And they're then just monitored, and someone is there watching. And if that person literally falls and hits the floor because they've overdosed, then they are provided with naloxone, revived, and if necessary, an ambulance is called. And so that is literally all a supervised consumption site or overdose prevention site is. It's a place where people get emergency first aid as recommended by medical professionals so they do not die. That's it. So if your community is, if you have other questions about that, I'd love to sort of talk about that. But like, once I realized that that's all that happened at these places, then I thought, okay, well, we obviously need to have these. And it turns out they have a perfect track record. So I provide statistics in my book, but they're in the millions of people who have visited, in the millions of visits rather globally to supervised consumption sites. Not a single person has died at one of them. And it's because the response to an overdose death is very, very, very effective. And it's, again, if you're there and you've got the support, you know what to do, you're going to live. So that was huge. And then as I began to think about and talk to others about sort of what were some of the common objections to supervised consumption sites, I began to see in the research they'd looked into those. So like, for example, do they encourage people to like start using drugs at them, right? Maybe that's a thought someone might have had. It turns out they don't. They did a big study of Insight, the first supervised consumption site in Canada, which is here in Vancouver. And I think they found like one person had ever had their first time use. Like that's not a thing, right? Just so we're clear. One person, that's not a thing. So most people were long-term intravenous drug users. They'd been using for a very long period of time. Well, what about this idea about, well, we want people to get into treatment? Well, it turns out people who go to these sites are actually more likely to get into treatment, okay? First of all, we're keeping people alive long enough so that they can, if they want to make the decision to get into treatment, they're able to stay alive long enough to make that decision, okay? But secondly, they're interacting with either peers, so people who use drugs, or they're public health nurses, or they're a sort of mix of health professionals there. And that's where they are able to get treatment of, for example, other health issues. So there's also a lot of benefit as well from sort of public health perspective. And the rates at which they enter treatment are higher. So people who attend these places are more likely to enter treatment. And yeah, so the other thing that happens at some places, not all, but there's some drug testing now. So these may be dips, or in some places they're very sophisticated lab equipment like spectrometers that will tell them what's in the drugs they're about to use. And you might go, well, maybe that's going to encourage people to use drugs. Again, it turns out no, like people who are told, yes, there's fentanyl, and we assume that's in all drugs now except for cannabis, that is, they actually do use less. So the studies found people were told, yeah, there's fentanyl, and it's mixed with some other stuff. I wasn't told that. I was told this was ecstasy or something. I didn't know it was fentanyl or just cocaine. And they've had people leave the drugs, say, I don't want them, just throw them out. So we're in a very different world when we're viewing this as a public health issue than if we're viewing it as a criminal law issue. Okay, so if it's a criminal law issue, then we're going to punish people, and we've found that doesn't work, and it's really expensive too, right? Costs about almost $200,000 a year to lock someone up in federal jail. Okay, the opioid crisis is costing us a huge amount of money in public health and criminal justice costs, billions and billions of dollars. No one's even tallied it. And yet we know from research been done in the United States that for every dollar you put into treatment and recovery, you save $12 in foregone criminal justice and public health expenses. So when I'm talking to like broad groups of people, you can see there's both like ethical and moral arguments about why our current approach is a failure, and there's also economic arguments, and for me also these faith-based convictions as well. And so I'd also mention the human rights of people. People have a right to health. They have a right to life. And it is a deprivation of their right to life under international law, under the charter, for provincial governments like in Ontario to deny funding and shutter, and also us municipal governments to, out of either ignorance or fear, oppose supervised consumption sites because they are life-saving medical support. Okay. You don't have city council votes on whether you're going to have EKG machines in your hospital. You don't have city council votes on whether or not we're going to allow parents to vaccinate their children. I hope you're not going to have a city council vote on who gets the COVID-19 vaccine or not. Yet we have city council votes on whether or not there are supervised consumption sites or not. And I can tell you those politicians who in 2020 vote against supervised consumption sites or overdose prevention sites, I have no concern in saying this without hyperbole, have blood on their hands. We know the research is clear. If they're in office to just, I don't know what you're in office for, but if you can't get behind supporting a life-saving medical intervention, you need to quit your job because you're killing people. I don't know how much more clear to get than that. And it's not an exaggeration, because unless you're willing to sit down and talk to family members whose loved ones have died and are calling for this now, then you are part of the problem, okay? You don't get to say, I didn't know. We're way past that, okay? And so, yeah, and this affects everyone, but it disproportionately affects marginalized people. And that's really why it's not being dealt with, right? So how can all these studies be ignored? It's because overwhelmingly it affects people who are Indigenous, who are poor, who've been imprisoned. And because of stigma, while it affects, people whose children are professionals and middle-class families as well, and privileged and white, because of the shame and stigma, you often don't hear about those deaths. It's that so-and-so died suddenly, right? Because of the shame and stigma. And the last thing I'll say on that, I guess, Jeffrey, is, when I looked into stigma, the World Health Organization, as I mentioned at the end of the book, did a survey of 14 countries or so around the world. And they're like, which people do you have the most stigma towards? Like, who do you not want coming to your house or your kid's birthday party? That's how I describe stigma. Like, who would you cross the street and not want to walk down the street with? And they listed a whole bunch of different people and types of classes of people. And the category of person that had the highest stigma across the world, including here in Canada, was people who use drugs. There was more stigma for people who use drugs than for people who have leprosy. They actually questioned on that. And so for me, that was another kind of knock across the head with a 2x4 when I remembered, Jesus going and touching the people who had leprosy and healing them, right? Kind of got my attention there too. Yeah.
I might have just quoted that quote of yours from the book where you talked about leprosy and drug stigma in a research essay that I wrote for school this week. So
great.
I'm glad that you just re-brought that up, because I just quoted that.
That got you too, eh? Yeah. It's compelling. I mean,
yeah. And I want to make sure that we give enough time to open it up to everyone for questions, but I'll just ask you one last question. So if people want to prepare their questions, you can either use the raise your hand function on Zoom, which is the top little corner there where the 3 dots are of your picture. It'll say raise your hand, and then I'll be able to see it, or you can type it into the group chat. You can either type it to me privately or publicly. I'm okay with either of those, but I thought maybe we would just sort of end this time of your sort of before questions with, you said you were talking a little bit about COVID-19 in Ontario during this time and the opioid crisis in Ontario during this time. Maybe talk about the current climate that we're facing, which is uniquely different. For example, I read your book at the beginning of the lockdown. I was on the wait list to get it as soon as it was published.
Great.
And got it right away. So it's a book that was written pre-COVID. So what does this time period sort of look like?
Yeah, well, they actually, funnily enough, the publisher just asked me like a week ago to write a little appendix to it with COVID in mind. They're going to do like a paperback August 2021, they said, or something. Everything gets pushed back. And yeah, so I've got a couple of quick charts I want to whip through. Those take like a minute or two, because I do want people to see the numbers here so you're aware of kind of what's going on. These are specific to Ontario. So can everyone see that? It's a map of Canada. Okay, so this is last full year, 2019. You can see Ontario has the highest number, total number of opioid-related overdose deaths in that year, and among the middle of the pack, near the higher end in terms of per capita. Okay, this is the Public Health Ontario report that just came out I think it might have been a few days ago. It's this month that came out. This is trends in opioid-related deaths from 2017 to 2019, okay? So this is the number of weekly deaths in Ontario before COVID-19, okay? So this is the number of deaths per week province-wide. You can see a real big spike here at one point. But you're looking at around kind of, I don't know if you average this out, probably around like just under 40 per week, which is a remarkable number. If you think about that, that's basically like every couple of months, like a fully loaded passenger jet crashing. Okay, so and these are entire communities. There are communities in Ontario that would be wiped out. No one would be alive if they were all in one place. You can see the numbers starting to really decline and drop off down here and then come back up. Then the lockdown happens, the state of emergency declared March 17th, and you can see the uptick taking place here. In terms of just making this a little bit more clear, overall there was a 38% increase in opioid-related overdose deaths in the first 15 weeks of the COVID-19 pandemic, okay, compared to the 15 weeks immediately prior. So you see a 38% increase. The public health officials in Ontario say that if Ontario continues at the same rate that it's at right now with this increase in overdose deaths during COVID, there will be 50% more people dying in 2020 than in 2019. So Ontario is on track to have just under 2,300 people this year die from opioid-related overdose deaths, 2,300. Now, I don't know how many people have died of COVID-19 in Ontario yet, but I can tell you in British Columbia, the statistics have completely eclipsed it. So, and by that, what I mean is we had more people die in 1 month of opioid-related deaths this summer than of all of COVID-19 combined to date, okay? And we just had statistics come out, I think it was today even from our coroner's office, they come out every month. And again, we broke our overdose death record, and we're a province that's just gone on COVID lockdown again, and we're dealing with death rates that are a fraction of that for COVID-19. Okay, and so these are two public health crises happening at the same time, simultaneously, and they are affecting each other. I talked about people not using alone. Well, what are we being told with COVID? Don't leave your house. Don't go with other people. So the public health information, and I'm not trying to criticize the COVID advice, let's be clear. The point is just that we have two public health emergencies and the advice is completely opposite, right? And so not enough thought has gone into how do you keep people alive during COVID-19 from this. And you can see very clearly massive uptick in fentanyl. So the blue charts, blue lines here are pre-pandemic, okay? So what were people overdosing on pre-pandemic? And then during the pandemic. So you can see the bar for fentanyl has shot way up, and the other bars are, you know, relatively stable. Hydromorphone also an opioid as well. Okay, so these are all opioids rather, but fentanyl is the synthetic drug, the street drug that we're talking about that has contaminated all the different street drugs. So it's become even more unpredictable, more toxic, and at the same time, politicians have either, you know, before COVID-19, they were opposed to supervised consumption sites and were shutting them down and not funding them, like in Alberta and Ontario. Well, COVID-19 has given them absolutely everything they needed to lock that door and nail it shut, right? So there needs to be safe ways that people can use safe drugs and treatment options. And we can't wait for COVID-19 to be over for that to happen, because the death rates are only increasing. And we knew they were going to happen as well. Like, you know, you mentioned about the book coming out end of March. I wrote an op-ed, you know, first or second week of April with the head of the Canadian Association of People Who Use Drugs, because we sat down and we're like, this is going to be a total disaster. And you know, it didn't. We're not geniuses. We just saw, like, if you're telling people to isolate, not associate with each other, and you're going to be shutting down these public health interventions that we know save lives, people are going to die, and it's what's happening. And not nearly enough is being done about this. So yeah, I guess I would love to hear your thoughts. I mean, the last thing and questions. The last thing I would say is, yeah, don't take my word for it. I mean, go and read some of these stories. If you want to read my book, great. If you don't, that's fine too. But talk to people who are knowledgeable about these issues, and that starts, quite frankly, with people who use drugs. And that's where I learned the most from, and, you know, begin to remove some of the stigma. And you'll find if you start talking with a bit more compassion and take the judgment out and be maybe honest about some of your own ways you've coped. Maybe you don't cope with substances. Maybe it's online shopping. I don't know what it is. Like, people have got their ways they self-medicate, including for pretty serious life trauma. Like, maybe it's food, you know, maybe it's bingo, maybe it's a sexual addiction. I don't know what it is. Like, people have got their things that they use to self-medicate. And We all have pain, but some people in our communities have suffered tremendous pain. And if we're going to judge them and blame them for using drugs, we have hard hearts, and we are condemning them. And you'd be amazed how many people will open up to you about their own substance use issues if they see you as a safe person, and that you're someone who has compassion and love. And isn't that the kind of person that you want to be? Would you rather be that, or do you want to be a moralizer who has a list of things and saying, don't do this, don't do that, right? We know that people's hearts get changed and then their behaviors change too, right? It doesn't work the other way around. You don't change your behavior and then change your heart. So trying harder to stop, using drugs does not help people stop using drugs.
Yeah, thank you. I see Bet has raised her hand. Bet, if you want to unmute yourself, you can ask your question.
I'm trying. I'm working on this stupid little tablet, and there we are.
You're good. You're good. Oh, you just disappeared. Did she hang up? Oh no, I will unmute you. Yeah, Bet, you're unmuted. Okay.
Great.
Do you want to ask your question, Bet?
My question is why do we tolerate this dualism between alcohol use and drug use? And then we sort of add pot to it, but we push out another poor bunch of people. Why do we do this? Why is it addicted versus unaddicted, safe uses versus unsafe use?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, more people die actually of alcohol and tobacco than do of opioids. That's just a fact. Like this year, literally more people will die. And so the reason why it's an opioid crisis, obviously, is because it's not a 40 or 20 or I don't have the public health data on this stuff, but decades long that leads you to death from alcohol and tobacco. Okay, and so they are socially accepted. And if you look at the history of drug prohibition in Canada, alcohol was brought to North America by white people. Okay, so alcohol was brought to North America by white settlers. It was part of the colonial process. And there's a really powerful book by a Indigenous lawyer called Firewater, and it's the subtitle is, if someone wants to look it up now, I can't remember exactly, but it's basically how alcohol is killing my people and yours. And he talks in detail about the ravages of alcohol and that in terms of Indigenous peoples. In my research, I wanted to know then, so why did we choose to prohibit and criminalize opioids instead of, either you legalize them and they're available like in a liquor store, which I don't advocate, but some people do, or you decriminalize and regulate them. And so that's what I advocate in my book, is I say people who use them should not be punished, but they shouldn't be readily available to anyone who wants them. Right? Someone who has a substance use disorder, though, I believe should have access to a safe supply, meaning of known potency and contents of those drugs, rather than forcing them to play Russian roulette with street drugs. Okay, and so that's the model I think we should get to. So why did we criminalize opioids? It goes back to British Columbia, actually, and the record of that is quite horrific and filled with all kinds of racism. Essentially, the end of the building of the National Railroad comes. British Columbia is entering Confederation, late 1880s, in the 1880s rather, and at that point decides we don't want any of the Chinese workers to stay. We want them all out of here. They're fine to come and build the railroad, and it's estimated, I think, one Chinese worker died for every kilometer of track laid. That's how dangerous it was, okay? They're paid like slave wages, essentially. So happy to have you come and work and build the railroad, but then you got to leave. So there are a whole series of racial exclusion and discrimination laws, which are just horrific, and I document them a bit in the book. And so there are then a series of anti-Chinese and anti-Japanese riots that happen in Vancouver. Tremendous amounts of, when I say white supremacism, it's not an exaggeration. Jeffrey, you've read the book, like those quotes from Johnny McDonald on this blew my mind. I knew he was a character, but I didn't realize how he talks about Canada needing to be an Aryan race and all this stuff. And I'm just like, what are you talking? This is not what you hear in school or even in popular press, even with all the Johnny McDonald stuff going on now. So basically, they send a report writer to come and look into these riots, and it was William Lyon Mackenzie King, and he comes and writes a report prior to being prime minister and says, hey, there's this opium problem in BC. We should criminalize these things. And one of the main pieces of evidence, the only piece of evidence he has, actually, not the main piece, the only piece is a couple of newspaper articles of white women who had gone to Chinese opium dens. And they are terrified of interracial marriage. That is the kick. That is what the historians have said. And there was actually a study done of whether alcohol should be prohibited or how should it be dealt with in BC. And it was by the first Chief Justice of BC, Matthew Begbie. And he concluded that alcohol was more of a social problem than the opium dens. So historically speaking, there was no basis whatsoever other than just racism for and appeals to morality. There's this idea that as a Christian nation, we could not allow for opium to be legal. And I guess just maybe a sentence on that. There's nowhere that I see in the Bible that says that anything that would be considered sinful must therefore be made a crime. I just want to make sure that that's on the table. There's no call for theocracy. You know, for those of you who are Christian, I know there's a number of you here. I just want to flag that because that's a really important piece. Some Christians, and I see this as a follower of Christ, get hung up on this idea that we should criminalize things because they're sinful. And, you know, like literally Jesus says as he's being arrested, he says, why did you come with weapons? Like my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my followers would have fought you, right? Jesus is about something bigger and different than like changing local laws. I don't believe that means there's nothing to say as Christians about our laws, but I also feel like that's something that needs to be said because, you know, 2/3 of Canadians self-identify as Christian, and the basis for drug prohibition in Canada was appeals to the Christian faith. And so as a Christian, I feel it's important to kind of speak to that as well and you know, interject in that way. So yeah, there's no good evidence. Even the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police is now calling for decriminalization. All right, so this has gotten to be a real growing chorus. And Vancouver this month has officially asked for an exemption from the Controlled Drug and Substances Act to be the first city in Canada to have decriminalized drugs in the city of Vancouver. And there has not been a decision on that yet by the federal government.
I'm not seeing questions. There's a comment, but I also wanted to comment. It was interesting in your book where you talk about where Justin Trudeau sits on the issue of decriminalizing drugs, or at least did in one particular meeting in Vancouver. But we'll leave that as a teaser for people to read the book because Ben really lays it out quite interesting what is said in that particular moment. So the comment that was made was, thank you, your presentation was fascinating and equally heartbreaking, and I really appreciated your direct calling out of politicians who are blocking SCSs. What I found most valuable, though, was your statement that, that it's better to start with someone's heart than their head when trying to enlighten them in regards with this issue. So maybe, Ben, if you're willing to share a little bit about that relationship with the head and heart that you found for yourself.
Yeah. I mean, that was just my own personal experience. And I think that a lot of people seem to get involved in this issue because they have had a loved one who's overdosed and died, or they know someone who has, and that wasn't my experience, right? And so that's why I think for this issue to get some traction, more people than those who are simply directly affected by it need to be able to be speaking up about it. And so I think hearing directly from family members is really important. There's an organization called Moms Stop the Harm. So if you guys anyone wants to take a look at that, Moms Stop the Harm, just Google that. And they are available to support with like grief support. Also, they support family members of those who are in what they call active addiction. And hearing their stories, they've got some of them online, is really powerful. And so part of the way that I wrote my book was appealing to both the people's hearts and their heads, right? It was so you can see most of the chapters start with a story or an anecdote, a real story of someone who's been affected in some way by these policies or laws, and then getting into the research and the stats. And I don't know if that works or not. I have to say I'm disappointed that more attention hasn't been paid to this already. And I'm, you know, even in the midst of COVID-19, I'm quite frankly like shocked that the Prime Minister continues to say that the ongoing criminalization of drugs is something that he supports. I find that like just confusing and wrong, and the reasons for it, like you said, are, well, teaser. Spoiler alert, they're related to politics, but we'll leave the rest for the book. Jeffrey's trying to help me out there. I don't actually need to sell these books to earn an income or anything, just so we're clear. It's not what this is about. We actually, donated some of the very nominal proceeds. And I was going to say it, Jeffrey, I have a copy here with me. So if you wanted to ask anyone who would like go in for a, draw the name out of the hat, I can send that out to someone if they wanted to. You can ask them to maybe send you their name if they're interested in that. But the rest of you can go and get a copy or whatever. Okay. But I do have a couple sitting around. I can throw maybe a couple in. Yeah.
I think why I'm telling them to seize it, I would love for you to be able to make money or give to organizations, but I also think it's one of the most accessible books that I've read about this. I've read a great number of books about it, written by doctors. Brody Raman, who's an MD in Ottawa, just wrote a book that came out at the same time as yours. And for those people who are lay people in this conversation, I found this book as a great introduction into the conversation.
Thank
so
you.
That's why I'm really sort of pushing it, because it's a great introductory book. I do see Philip Cable asked a question, and I think it's a really valuable question, especially for those in Barrie that maybe are struggling in the conversation around supervised consumption sites in the city. And it was, Ben, what do you say to people who do not want a supervised site in their neighborhood?
Yeah, so first thing I would say is that there are already people in your community who are overdosing and dying. The people who access a supervised consumption site, the research shows, live within walking distance of it, okay? There are some cases of people like driving in. So we're talking about, this is not gonna like bring a whole bunch of people to a place that they are not already typically in. And I would say, look at what the mayor of Calgary said, okay? He was really skeptical. So he only wanted one for Calgary, okay, big city. And so what happened is, yeah, there was in the downtown core people like, this is the place we go to not die. Okay, that's all they're all right. This is where you go to not die. So what happened is a lot of people went there who used drugs, and there was some concerns, and many of them were found to be unfounded, and there's a lot of misinformation and fear mongering and that. But his reply to those concerns was, I clearly made a mistake, as Naheed Nenshi, the mayor of Calgary, said on the public record. He's like, we needed more, not less. The answer is not fewer, it is more. And so because, places like Vancouver have multiple sites and still not enough, by that actually shares the caseload, if you will, and then people don't have to wait as long and so forth. I would also say in terms of neighborhood impact, there have been peer-reviewed studies done. You need to look at the peer-reviewed studies. You can't look at the report from Alberta, which was roundly denounced by public health experts as methodologically unsound and politically biased. So if anyone tries to cite that report, you can go online and say, we know that there have been calls for that report's retraction. It's not a valid source. So I mean, just start from that square one. But basically, the peer-reviewed studies show that things like crime in the vicinity, what's called drug paraphernalia debris, these actually go down. They don't go up. And the police are supportive of these sites as well, because they give someone who they don't want to charge. They say, don't use in public or don't use in this public park area. Here's the site. Head down there. Okay. So that's what I would say. But I have to just acknowledge, Philip, your question. Like this, not in my backyard, or it's called NIMBYism. It's a real thing. It's something which also has been a factor in approving things like social housing as well. And so I think that we have to just acknowledge that people who are in communities where these public health or housing interventions are being placed have fear. They're driven by fear and they have concern. So I think we have to work with them too, right? We have to not only educate them, but engage with them. And when you put in a supervised consumption site, you should be thinking about things like, how do we build community support? How do we involve the community? How do we do things like ensure that some of their concerns are going to be managed, whether it's with respect to access and entry, or in Vancouver, there's a phone number I can call and they will come and pick up a used syringe if I find it anywhere in the city, right? There's also drop boxes that are put around so people can dispose of their used syringes and such. So there's a lot of things that can be done, but it starts actually with political leaders saying, we need to do this. This is the right thing. We don't have debates about whether there's a hospital in your community because you're going to have to hear ambulances coming. In fact, maybe people would complain about that. but they've got to be available widely in the community to be effective.
Great. I am recognizing the time, and we do have another question. So are you okay for about another 5 minutes, Ben? Okay. Guy asked a question. Are you able to comment on what public opinion / support is like in Vancouver compared to other Canadian cities / parts of the country?
Yeah, I don't actually know the sort of like polling data on supervised consumption sites. Those polls often vary depending on the way the question's asked and that kind of thing too. But they're on the big issue of like drug prohibition and decriminalization. There's actually a lot of support for that. The problem is that there's also a lot of fear mongering, right? And so some politicians make their way based on scaring. I'll just be honest. They make their way by scaring senior citizens, okay? And they make their way by scaring parents of young children, okay? Those people vote in big numbers too. And they come to meetings like this too, okay? So I remember being involved in politics, and those days where, you'd see issues come up, and if they were issues raised by politically, important and powerful groups in society, these are groups that vote in large numbers, they donate to political parties, they volunteer, for example, they call the letter to the editors, they show up at town halls, their issues get dealt with, and they get dealt with pretty quickly, and money gets put in. Those by marginalized or disenfranchised groups don't. They don't get dealt with, and they get worse over time. And that's why we still don't have clean drinking water on, every reserve in Canada. There's a reason why that has happened, and it's part of this ongoing legacy of colonization. And the opioid crisis is part of that. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that, in some detail, that Indigenous peoples have been massively overrepresented in overdose rates and overdose deaths. In particular, Indigenous women. The opioid crisis generally is somewhere between 70–80% killing men. When you look at Indigenous communities, it's not that way. It's actually a much larger proportion of Indigenous women are also overdosing and dying. So in terms of public polling and support, I'm not familiar with any particular data on things like the supervised consumption sites, but I would draw an analogy a bit to the legalization of cannabis. So there was, if you remember just a couple of years ago, that was still like controversial, but I'm not familiar with any like federal politician, like the federal conservatives are not running on a platform to recriminalize cannabis, right? Like once these cats get out of the bag and people are like, oh, the sky didn't fall, then they tend to sort of stick. And for things like a supervised consumption sites, there's decades worth of experience with them and how they work and how they can be implemented. And so it is very much, I think, just the fear of the unknown, but also just a high level of stigma about who drug users are and what they bring. And this correlation somehow between drug use and crime, which actually is largely because of them being criminalized. The reason that people who are not all drug users, obviously, but some people who are really at a difficult place in their life and they don't have income to support their substance use disorder. And obviously there's a correlation between that and some people engaging in petty theft and breaking into vehicles and stuff like that. And what the defense lawyers and judges I talked to said is once they saw people getting, for example, access to safe supply, it turns out that they don't get charged with anything else anymore. And I'm not just talking drug charges, all of these other charges. Okay, so by criminalizing the substance, we're basically driving people underground so they're more likely to overdose and die, and we're compelling them to go to the criminal underworld to get their substances they're addicted to, right? And I would say it's easier for me right now. In 10 minutes, I can be in the downtown east side and purchase fentanyl easily. I'd have to look for a couple of days to find unpasteurized milk, right? That would take me a while. Why? Well, milk is regulated, all right? So, and we can talk about unpasteurized milk, but the point being, when you have a substance that's contaminated and you regulate it, people can have access to it and safely available. So once I got through this, it all seemed like a no-brainer, but I have to say, if you're not there yet, I was not either. I mean, this took me, 4 or 5 months of meeting with people, talking with people, reading the research, having that heart change. But we need to keep pushing and pushing and pushing, because at some point there's a breaking point in public opinion. That's why I was really encouraged, Jeffrey, to, that you're doing this tonight. And, you're all ambassadors on this. I'm hoping many of you, or if not all of you, become, ambassadors on this particular issue. And by that, I mean, give voice to those people and pass the mic to those people in your community who are working on this issue, because there has to be, and they may not be organizations that or are involved with, but doing that kind of outreach is really important. And ask them, what do you think is needed right now, right? How can we support your work? What can I do to help? Maybe it is calling your city councilors or something. I don't know, but I would encourage you to don't leave this tonight as just a talk. Don't just go on social media and like this, or, hey, I heard this guy talk. That doesn't count enough for action these days, right? That's not what you need to see in your community is actual concrete change on the ground.
Great. And there was another hand raised. So we'll make this the very last question. And I know it's Jill. It says Harold's iPad, but Jill, if you want to talk, unmute yourself.
Yep. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
yeah.
Perfect.
So first, thank you. That was a great presentation. It's awesome to hear the compassion that you have, because I think coming from somebody who, it's hard to understand the addictions issue if you haven't lived that yourself. So it's great, like you said, to get back in that and remind yourself where these people come from, and, that there's often a reason behind why they've turned to using drugs. My question is just more around like the safe consumption sites. What is sort of the stigma among people using them? Is there stigma within that too? Or have you found in your research that people are pretty open to going to these sites, things like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there still is a stigma. I'd heard about kind of rare instances of what was described to me as like businessmen going to some, but I think that the stigma bar has got to be pretty high for them. And so because drug users are throughout all society, all tiers of society, class and race, you're going to need to provide services in a way that are going to make people feel not judged and included. And so for people who are homeless or in precarious housing, that's going to look different than for someone who's like a college student, for example, right? Or a middle-aged, middle-income professional. And so we haven't actually really got there yet, even in BC, but rolling out supervised use, or what is called witnessed use, to a whole bunch of settings is something that I encourage and support in the book. And so, for example, this doesn't need to be super complicated. And there actually are laws that support both, protect you from both criminal sanction if you are responding to an overdose, and if you are, civilly, if you did try to save their life and they die. I'm not giving legal advice here, just so we're clear, but there are good Samaritan laws that protect against that. The reason why an official supervised consumption site, that's a legal term, the reason that's important is anyone in that facility, staff or drug users, is immune from criminal prosecution for those drug offenses while they're there. Okay, that does not apply to, for example, if I had a friend come over and I actually said to someone yesterday, I said, and again, it's someone who just opened up, that he actually overdosed. Someone I just met. He overdosed the other night and was sent to hospital. And I just said to him, hey, just don't use alone. I said, don't promise me that you're going to stop using drugs. That's what he thought I was going to say. I said, don't promise me you're going to stop using. Promise me you're not going to use alone. That's the only promise I want to hear from you right now, right? And if you wanted to come, he lives in Alberta, but if you want to come over and use drugs, I have a Naloxone kit, and I'll be like, okay, you're gonna use it in your car after you leave. You're gonna use it here. You might as well do it here. Just do it. And that's no different. But I would be. There's some readings of the law which says I'd be, potentially, liable for something there, and that's why we have to just get the criminal law out of this mess. Just to show you how ridiculous it gets with this stuff, and how we need to really open up and mainstream, I think is my best answer to your question, is we need to mainstream these public health services. There was drug testing being done at a pharmacy here in Vancouver, and the College of Pharmacists sent a warning letter to the pharmacist for testing the drugs, because the people would come and pass the drugs, and they would test them and pass the drugs back. They said, you're a drug trafficker. That's what they said to the pharmacist, you're a drug trafficker. You're breaching federal, it's an indictable offense. And you're like, not drug trafficking. Technically you are. You took possession, you handed them back. That's technically drug trafficking. What ridiculous things we're doing now in Canada still. And this is in the middle of a public health emergency, right? Imagine if you had to test yourself for COVID, okay? Pass the swab back. Just get that thing way up in your nose, okay? Like, really, I mean, this is absurd. Either it's a public health emergency, or we're going to keep playing this game that it's some sort of criminal issue and more lives are going to get lost.
Thank you very much, Ben. I have shared with other groups that in my 20s, I was a person that lived with a substance use disorder to Oxycontin, and I am very grateful for the work that you have done to help others who are living within that cycle. So thank you so much. I see in our chat, there is a lot of thank yous right now. Natalie H. says, thank you for taking the time to talk with us today in this very short period of time. Your knowledge on this topic is evident. I agree very much with the best way to learn about substance misuse is to speak to people who suffer with this. Michiko has shared a link in the chat for people who are interested in making connections with this work in their ministry / faith. I'd like to suggest you check out the resource feminary.com/harm reduction. There's lots of opportunities for outreach, including offering prayers, vigils, blessing of naloxone kits, and lots more. Michiko did host a blessing of naloxone kits and training in their worship service.
Wow.
I'm hoping Michiko will talk when we do the theology of harm reduction conversation.
Wow, can I come to that one? I want to hear that. I would really appreciate that. That's so encouraging. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and Michiko has shared a bit more here too. Also, re-NIMBYism, our call as Christians is to serve those at the margins, not keep people with privilege happy. Many wins for SCSs have been from people just making OPS and risking arrest to do what's necessary. Thank you. And I see a lot of appreciation here, Ben, and thank you for being here with us and joining us tonight.
Thanks. Yeah, I would just say just to put all that back to your group and those people. Like, I really don't mean this in a false humility way. I take no credit for any of kind of this change in my heart. Like, I'm not like I said to someone today, I said, I don't like pray and read the Bible because I'm a good person. I do it because I'm a bad person. Like, no, I mean that. I really do. Like, we got to kind of come to these conversations with some humility, I think, and just acknowledge, like, I'm just sharing what I learned. And I hope that it will change some people's minds. And if it's a good resource for you in your fight there, I hope it will be useful. And I will add, I mean this seriously, Jeffrey, I'm happy to brief or talk to any of your public officials if you guys want to do that, or get a meeting, or put forward a letter, or, support, whatever you like. Just whatever I can do to support you and use that position, I'm happy to do it. And I just thank you again for what you're doing in this area. It's really encouraging.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Benjamin.